Welcome to Santa Barbara Talks with Josh Molina. I'm here with Doss Williams, and this is going to be such a wonderful conversation. Of course, Doss is the longest serving elected official in the region, going back 20 years. And so we're going to do a little bit of a retrospective on his career, his life, going back to the good old days, so to speak, when he was first elected to the city council and even before, growing up, all over IV, Ojai, you get a little bit of that story as well. And hopefully by the end, Doss, we'll get to the modern date and you'll break the news maybe of what your next job will be. But that will be future episodes. How you doing today, Doss?
I'm doing great. There's just got back from the California State Association of Counties, and there's great surf out there. It's a good day. I'm sorry I can't make you a cappuccino to go along with mine, but I'm getting used to this virtual world we live in now. Josh, it's a little crazy, man.
I know. Yeah, no, you've made me more than more than a few cappuccinos over the years. So I know I have my own coffee here today with my own Santa Barbara Talks cup, by the way, product placement. So yeah, but it's not, I'm sure that it doesn't taste the same as the Doss Williams special. So let's talk Doss. Let's go back. I think that we've been around a while, of course, so we have this history. And so people may not know, may not recall sort of how you got your start, your roots, and how you got into public service as a incredible activist, right? I think the hardest working campaigner, on the ground, strategist, just nobody could compete with you in terms of the amount of hard work that you put into a campaign. And then, of course, you always got a lot of people around you to also canvas for you. So let's go back in that time. Let's go back to 2003 when you were first elected and you shook up City Hall. If you recall, I spent a lot of time with you back then, and I was just kind of captivated by the campaign. Like, who is this guy? Even though I knew you, like, this guy's actually going to try to do this and pull this off. The council was a lot of older people at that time. I think you were 29 when you took office. Take me back.
I've been 27. Yes, yeah, it was very young. Yeah.
Take me back to that time and what was going on, and why did you decide I want to go from being the activist to the elected?
Well, it was a strange one, right? I had gotten into state politics, but I had gotten real burnt out of being sent on campaigns all over the state. Wanted to stay in my own hometown. I grew up in Isla Vista, Ojai, Santa Barbara. So I wanted to be back here. I wanted to stay back here. And I got slowly drawn back into politics. I had even I was starting graduate school when I was asked to be Gail Marshall's campaign manager for the No on Recall campaign. And what's interesting is a lot of the same folks that worked together on the No on Recall are still around and are still doing progressive politics. My campaign consultant was a young man running the walk crew in the No on Recall campaign. Stephanie Langsdorf, who was my number one on that campaign, she's at the county in human resources. So there's a lot of dedicated people. It wasn't just me that shook this all up. It's because of a lot of grassroots activists that saw that we could make a difference and do something good.
So it was you being the one to stop the recall of Gail Marshall. And from that, people said you should run for city council, or you said, I'm going to run.
I think it gave a lot of street cred. I had done campaigns elsewhere. I had only done a couple here. It was also, I think people saw the work that I did on the living wage campaign. And I don't think people understood as much how deeply my environmental values were. From growing up in Isla Vista, that it's pretty hard not to fall in love with the place that we live, the coastline, the ocean. I had not as much scientific background as I do now, which is one of the reasons why I went back to grad school, to the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management. But I hadn't really planned on getting dragged back in so quickly. I literally had started graduate school in the fall of that year, 2002, and was doing the no on recall. And then, so all the time I was running for city council, I was also having to make classes and do schoolwork. It was a crazy time.
So let's freeze that for just a moment, and we're going to come back to what it was like when you were campaigning. But you mentioned Isla Vista, growing up in Isla Vista, and for a time, you and I went to Isla Vista Elementary School at the same time. We're out on the playground there, and I remember a moment of conversation, a little bit of arguing on the playground. What a surprise, right? Back then, but you've talked about this. So you grew up in Isla Vista. What did Isla Vista, how did it shape you? And talk to us a little bit about your life back then in terms of your upbringing. You had a bit of a rocky upbringing, so talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I did have a rocky upbringing. My parents are great people. Malcolm Galt Williams, and Maria Stover. Back then she was Dietz, but they were divorced when I was 2, and maybe it represents a slice of the times, right? They're both baby boomers. My dad was a political radical and wanted, to change the world. My mom was a religious conservative and wanted to change the world in a different way, spiritually. Both of them wanted to change the world, but the home life was not awesome because they were divorced when I was 2 and moving around a lot and different people. And it already gave me a sort of sense of pragmatism when I started thinking philosophically or politically that, hey, the goals of a revolution is great, but if you want to change the world, you got to start at home, and you got to start with things sometimes a little bit at a time, right? Changing the world one piece at a time. And I do think that affected the way that I approach public policy. And then, the coastline. I grew up surfing, and loving the space that we had. And I think there's something special about this place. I think there's something special about California and about nature and about the kind of life that we can live when we are more attuned or more compatible with nature and with the environment.
Yeah. Were you a good student, a good kid? My impression of you is that you would have been the kid who was fidgety, always looking for attention, kind of a rabble rouser, and had a hard time staying still. What kind of kid were you growing up?
I was a good student, but I was a weird kid. I mean, don't get me wrong, right? I was like reading Tolkien when I was in 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade. And when you remember me on the playground, I would often be wearing a hoodie, and like when I would pretend that when the hood went on, it was like the Hobbits and Lord of the Rings, where it's that like semi-invisibility cloak, like the cloaks of Lothlorien, right? That make you camouflaged, I was not the easiest probably kid to talk to because I moved so much. I didn't have a whole lot of friends. But Isla Vista awakened something else in me. A lot of the kids that I first got to know there, I still know and am friends with. Hopefully that means including you. But
That's on your end, not mine.
But that, like Joel Stevenson, Christo Artucio, there are many actually great folks who grew up in Isla Vista. Isla Vista, contrary to what people think, it was a great place in some ways to grow up. But, because you have a lot of freedom, especially if you had no parental supervision like me. You can bike and walk everywhere. There's, surf spots and interesting things to check out. Because of the work of the park district, including my dad and his political allies, there was a lot of open space that's always remained in Isla Vista. He would never say that I'm the guy to get all the credit, but he was a part of that movement. And so it was a great place to grow up. As I got older, I realized it was a lot better as a boy than as a girl. And that's obviously the great thing that's still pretty terrible about Isla Vista is like, it's a fairly safe place and wonderful place to be a boy, a very dangerous place to be a young woman. So I recall it fondly, but now I'm older. I also know the things that I wasn't seeing at that time.
Yeah, and back then families lived in Isla Vista. Of course, we still do have families living there, but it's fewer. But parts of Isla Vista back then were just working class families who lived, on Abrego, not necessarily Del Playa, but closer to Goleta, or what's now Goleta. And we've seen those families driven out, obviously, by landlords and increasing rents and rent evictions and students. And of course, going to college is amazing, but university not building enough housing for students. And that whole community, I get really bothered as a local when people say it's a college town, because it's really a community there, and it's still a community of people who live there. And I wish it was as diverse as it was back then, and not just 10 people crammed into a 2-bedroom or something. And that was that back in the day. Did you get into a lot of fights as a teenager, as a kid? You're obviously scrappy. You like politically mixing it up. You don't have a problem challenging the establishment. Were you getting into squabbles with people who didn't like your attitude way back then?
Not in IB. The only fights maybe I got in was with Mr. Wheeler, the fourth grade teacher that you might remember, because he was arch conservative politically. So I definitely argued with him. But no, I was kind of small, and no, it wasn't until I had the cultural shock of going from Isla Vista and the relatively cosmopolitan place that Dos Pueblos High School is, from there to Paso Robles High. At there, I got into fights, definitely, because Isla Vista is a very diverse place. It's not necessarily a place where you are as conscious of racial differences, because there's just so many. Back then, there were so many different people of so many different races, it steeped me partially in Latino culture, even though I don't have the sangre. It was great, and I loved it. And as I got older and had to, at one point, move to Paso Robles, that was rougher. There was, like, the racial divide was much more stark in Paso at that time, and I wasn't ready to cower in the corner.
What did you want to be when you were at that age, when you were in high school? I know it was not what you are now.
Yeah, no, I was always, even in high school, trying to figure out how could I do the most for protecting the environment. But of course, my ideas back then were much more like kind of young guy ideas. A colleague of mine says that when I was a kid, I was a mixture of Greta Thunberg and Red and the Wolverines from Red Dawn. You remember that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, I never thought about it that way, but that is actually true. A little true. I was weirdly precocious, very annoying to my friends about like why they should be like adhering to strong environmental values when they're 15, right? But and I was militant. Yeah, I wanted to convince my friends to all get sufficient training to stop the illegal logging in the Amazon that was destroying indigenous communities in the rainforest by force. That's what I wanted to do when I was 15.
Right. Yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me. I remember we used to have religion and atheism fights, evolution versus religion, if you recall. And at that time, you were Mr. Evolutionist, and I was Mr. God, Christian God. And we would, but you were definitely, if you disagreed with you were wrong. It wasn't like a gray area, and now I think we probably have met each other in the middle there on that whole topic. Obviously.
So the arguments I got into you were similar to the arguments I got into with my grandfather. And my grandfather was just an amazing human being whose life story, sometime we should do a podcast on, because he was a POW in Nagasaki, during the World War II and things like that. But he had a deep faith. He had a deep faith because, for a number of reasons, but especially because he had made it through incalculable odds. But he was very patient with it. We debated all the time, and I was a disciple of science, and he was a disciple of Jesus. And I think I won every argument, but obviously I lost the war because I adopted the faith when I was about 17.
Yeah. I think it was my argument that had to sit with you for a couple decades, and then you're like,
I'm sure it helped. I'm sure it helped. I'm still an evolutionist, though.
God made it happen. Right.
Theistic evolution, yes.
So, you, Paso Robles, DP, I am very familiar with your City College story, Dr. Eskandari, Dr. John Kay, these people having huge pivotal impact in your life. Was City College the place that turned it around for you? I mean, you were going from being kind of lots of ideas, militant, wanting to change the world, and then what happens at City College that begins to set the path for the guy we see now?
It definitely gave me more of a path, and there was 4 professors. Some people that are real old timers will remember Dr. Lawyer. And Dr. Haslund is still around, lives in my district, just down the road, and Dr. Eskandari and Dr. K. And, I think all of them, with their really top quality political science education, contributed to a more institutional path, but also a more rewarding path for me of being able to make a difference. The other thing that affected it was going to South Africa for the first elections in 1994. And a lot of the people I worked with there had persevered and fought against the apartheid regime in the unconventional ways that were necessary at the time, and had been tortured and had, in some cases had to take lives. And so that experience was kind of like a wake-up call to me about that maybe even the politics of the United States, which sometimes seems grayer, less black and white than young people would prefer, but that there's still something special about being able to make the world better without ending up being tortured or having to take lives.
So did you go to South Africa while you were at City College, that era?
I did so right afterwards.
Oh.
I did so after my first semester at Berkeley.
Okay.
So in the beginning of 1994, I was there.
So talk a little bit about your Berkeley years. I've heard various things. We won't go into them, but what was Berkeley like for you? Were you the radical kid in Berkeley too, or were you just a little fish in a big pond there?
No, I was definitely into into making political change.
Yeah.
But as a young Democrat, I was like on the far moderate wing of any of any movement stuff there. So I was part of the protests to defend affirmative action, protests for good causes, environmental causes at Berkeley. But I was always part of it, but at the moderate wing, because the campus Democrats, compared to some other campus groups, were not as radical.
Mm-hmm.
Let's put it that way.
Did you enjoy Berkeley? What was that? How did that impact you and shape who you would become?
Totally. I mean, Berkeley is an amazing place to get an education. It's also an amazing place to live. The politics of it are also amazing. Though I wanted to do politics and have a contribution to politics where ideological differences were not were more acute or more pronounced. I did some campaigns there and did some political work. For a while, my job was registering voters at 12th Street and Broadway in Oakland, back when it was a rough neighborhood. But I loved, the experience of meeting people where they are, and talking to them about how to make the world a little better.
Yeah, my son goes to Berkeley, and I don't know if you've been there lately, but People's Park, they drove out all of the homeless at 3 a.m. and then with military and law enforcement, and it's all shipping containers now around the park. So, and it's guarded full time around the clock, but it is an amazing community. It's like you, as much as you love Santa Barbara, Goleta, and we're so progressive here, you go to a place like that, holy cow, right? They're so far ahead of, here, everything you do, people look at it, there, it's like nothing because there's so much activism and civic engagement going on. So when did you graduated Berkeley, and then there's a period between that and running for city council. So what are you doing that period? Are you there, some people who said like, oh, or they don't know your job history. So what did you do during that period?
So in my final years at Berkeley, I met someone who's still a great friend of my wife and I, Lynn Lyman. She was my college sweetheart, and we were we were going to be soldiers for the Democratic Party, go out and do campaigns everywhere, and we did. We ended up not staying together, but the first thing I did was start doing campaigns around the state for the Democratic caucus of the state legislature, and so Long Beach, I did campaign L.A., Long Beach, and in Santa Barbara, which is what helped me come home. But for a while, all over the state.
Yeah.
And then the moment that I got to come home is from working all over the state is when Hannah-Beth Jackson ran for state assembly.
Yeah. So, the city council, right? So think about everything you had done up until this point. Big picture, big time player, the world. You've been to South Africa, across the country. What's attractive to you about being on the Santa Barbara City Council where they're talking about neighborhood preservation or whatever? Talk to me about how did that motivate you to go to work there?
Well, a couple things. I mean, I loved working for successive speakers of the assembly. I got a lot out of it. A lot of the folks I'm still, work with in state politics comes out of that time. But there was one campaign in particular where that I was sent on, and I was like, for the first time, I was like, hey, I think I got sent to help the wrong person.
Hmm.
And, I know a good soldier is supposed to obey the chain of command, and I did, but I got out as quickly as I could after that. I wanted to make the decisions of who I would back and who I would campaign for, so that I made sure I was always doing the right thing and
So,
not.
so you're in the middle of working for somebody and you're like, I don't like this person. I should be for the other person. Mhm. And
Yeah.
and so did you what'd you do? Did you decide to toss some of the literature when no one was looking?
No, 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 no. You can't do that. When you are part of the warrior class of the Democratic Party, you keep a letter of resignation in your drawer if anything ever goes wrong. But you see things through to the end, and I saw things through to the end, and I resigned very quickly afterwards.
Yeah. So you're doing all this work and you're like, I'm going to go for it on Santa Barbara City Council. You're also working for cause at this point. Is that correct? Or
No, so I quit working for the speaker.
the speaker?
Um, you're right, and because there's a structure to this. It's not just like jumping from one place to another. It's that I was working for the Democratic Caucus of the state legislature,
Yeah.
right? The assembly, what back then was called, the Democratic Caucus of the Assembly, and the speaker. So I gave up things with the speaker. I actually tried to get out of politics.
Hmm.
I had a friend who had started, an internet startup in their basement. Um,
Can't
you
even
know,
imagine. I'm so glad that failed.
well, anyway, the company was successful,
Oh,
but and it was like a cool experience. I mean, it was very much like a late '90s experience, right? Like he was in his 20s. He was the founder. My little brother showed up I would stay with him when I would do campaigns in LA. And one time my brother came over to visit him, who was like maybe 18. And my brother showed him his art. And he's like, if he can do art like that, I wonder what kind of programmer he would be. Has he ever programmed? I'm like, no. He's like, well, tell him to read this. And he hands me a book on programming languages, and he makes a programmer out of him.
oh.
And my that's my brother's career was from that moment. And my little brother, and I tried to work with their company. I was supposed to be their like philanthropy guy, and I did some of that, but inevitably I got drawn in to run an entire support department of 32 employees. Mind you, the company had 86 employees. I was the one of the 5 people that were over the age of 25. And we even had a high school kid who was a brilliant programmer, who we would get on the train from San Diego. I think it was San Diego on Friday, or he'd come up and work all weekend long. Probably drank a lot of Mountain Dew, and then we'd send him back on the train on Monday morning, right? So he could go to school still, high school.
But you didn't like that. It didn't work out.
I mean, I don't think this is anybody that knows me is surprised. it's hard for me to get motivated by making money. That's just never been like a good motivator for me. So when the company couldn't quite do the level of philanthropy that I really like wanted to be involved in, it was probably easy for Hannah-Beth to convince me to come back. And so I did. I came back and I did another campaign for Hannah-Beth, and I started working for Cause
Yeah.
and the
And
living wage campaign.
living wage campaign. So I'm going to ask one kind of tough question here, just because some people
Oh,
will
good.
be like, Josh, what happened to you? No. But so, no, Doss, I've been accused of putting you on a pedestal journalistically, right, over the years. Putting you in a light that sort of makes you come across as kind of like the be all end all political strategist who could is going to change the world. I've probably written that at some point. um at what point do you start to become aware of yourself as, I'm Doss Williams and I'm going to do things. Starting to think of yourself with an ego, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but where you're going from the insecure little kid growing up with the divorced parents who has no supervision, and you're kind of on your own, and all of a sudden you're successful and you're doing great campaigns, and people are telling you how great you are. At what point does the light bulb go off and you're like, I'm special, right? I can do something here with this that is different than most of the people I see around me. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I don't know where I made the jump from being aware of my potential to make a difference as a soldier, as an organizer, as as somebody working to make political change in, person to person, to running for elected office. I don't know precisely where that happened. I think a lot of it has to do with when you're part of the campaign class in politics, especially when you're good. The senior people want you to keep on doing that.
Yeah.
And they don't want you to be doing policies for the smart kids that went to elite schools and got graduate degrees and wear suits, and you don't give policy to the street fighters, right? And so eventually I realized if I wanted to do policy and I wanted to do environmental policy, I was going to have to run. Nobody was going to hand it to me. I had to run to do it. So, I could have envisioned a much different path if somebody had been like, hey, you want to work for the Assembly Committee on Natural Resources? I would have loved to make policy that way. But I was a kid out of IB, I did voter registration. I did grassroots campaigns. I did not fit the profile of the people that you hand policy work to. So I had to campaign to do it.
Yeah. And so you were very successful with the living wage ordinance, working with Cause, and you ran on that when you ran for city council. And at this time, it's Helene Schneider, who I think was right around your age, a couple of years older than you, and you both got elected. I think Barnwell got elected during that campaign as well.
Yes.
You, Celine, you, and Barnwell. Um, as much as you can recall, what was the strategy there? How did you do that? How did you win? I've told anyone who's ever asked, I've reported it, that, I've never seen anyone work as hard as you when it comes to organizing, canvassing. You were a bit of and I don't mean this in a negative way, but you had kind of like a cult-like following at the time. People were willing to do it, they're willing to campaign for you, at all hours of the day and weekends, and they believed in your cause, and you were their mentor, their leader, right? And I watched all of that during the campaign, and for me, it was nothing like I had seen before. Talk to me about your strategy back then. Like, how did you decide that you were going to do this? And I know you, like, you don't do anything to lose. Like, you're going to put yourself in a situation to win, and you did. Talk to me about that time.
Well, it was, I think it was a unique campaign because we were trying to both campaign um, on environmental platform, but also one that would empower, working class Santa Barbarans, and remember back then, elections were on off year elections,
Yeah.
low turnout. The median age of the voter was a lot older than me. I look at the pictures of myself back then and I go, God, must have really thought I was in, and they did. They thought I was really young. A lot of people were like, "Oh, did you just graduate from UCSB?"
Oh,
And I had some experience and I had relevant experience, but I look at the picture of myself and I'm like, no wonder they thought I was a kid, right?
yeah.
Um, uh, the uh, the strategy was to empower all neighborhoods. Traditionally, in campaigns in the city, and this was the conventional wisdom at the time, you remember, you just have to win the golden triangle, right? That was the conventional wisdom.
Mhm.
That if you walk the certain richer neighborhoods and get their votes, and you get on council. And I walked those neighborhoods too. I'm not. I wanted to represent all neighborhoods, not just some. But we gave a very strong emphasis to the West Side, East Side, downtown, the even the Bungalow Haven. All these neighborhoods where you had lower voter turnout, and my understanding, is that that was the first election in a long time, maybe in decades, where the flats elected two council members.
Mhm.
Um, and that was a big change in local politics.
Yeah. It was something really amazing to watch because, I have no doubt saying this is 100% true. I knew you were going to win from day one. Like, it was no doubt in my mind, but no one else thought you were going to win. A lot of the establishment did not think you were going to win. Like, who's this guy? Who's this young kid? Oh, he's an activist. But even to this day, people don't understand the power of hard work. And I think that's the thing that has separated you and other candidates, in these close races was that hard work. But I knew you were going to win because it's like, this is something different about this guy. And then you had your strategy. You weren't just running on ideas. You had ideas. You you knew how to win. What was what no one saw. It was the behind the scenes stuff. Far as talking to as many people back then, what were the issues? Like, I can recall, obviously, the living wage, neighborhood preservation, mansionization of the mesa. We saw these people building lot line to lot line. Housing was a discussion back then, but it wasn't the big discussion that we are having now. What were the issues you focused on then?
Well, clean water was a big one back
Yeah.
then, but affordable housing was too.
Hmm.
That's one of the real changes I think that Helene and I, but the whole council, but we dug our heels in about is that we wanted more of the city's funds to be going towards affordable housing, and we wanted the inclusionary requirements for market rate housing so that there would be a piece for people who need affordable housing. I think that was a positive change that we created. It's one of the things I'm still proud of.
When you won, and those next day you're sworn in, what's going through your mind? I think that I have this impression of you that you're fully self-aware of what's happening. And as I've gotten older, I'm starting to think maybe that's not the case. You may not see yourself the way I might see you or some others might see you. In that moment, here you are, you're on the city council, you're the lost kid. Not that long ago, you're 29 years old, and now you have to wear the suits now, and you got to hang with all these people you've been fighting against. What's going through you during this period?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think perfect self-awareness is possible in human beings. And especially right after the campaign, it wasn't there. If you campaign the way that we did, after the campaign's over, you collapse, right? You're not saving anything for the swim home. And so, there's a phase like that. And then all of a sudden you're up on the council, and there's real important things for the people of Santa Barbara right in front of you really quickly. Things like the conditional use permit for Casa Esperanza, which is now PATH. If you remember, that was one of the big first fights at council after I was sworn in.
People were.
And it was a 4-3 vote.
Okay, right.
And there's some other ones I recall fondly, like from that first year, like the Ablitz Tower,
right?
That we approved even though it was heretical from a Spanish colonial standpoint, but we liked it. But the Casa Esperanza thing, I still that still gives me meaning. I still recall that moment, right?
Yeah.
And I was also kind of like did things that maybe I thought that people might have found a little strange or scandalous. For that in particular, that debate was a real interesting one to me. I used to have in my office a quote by Hubert Humphrey, and one of the folks who wanted to terminate the CUP for the homeless shelter for Casa Esperanza referenced it directly and said, this is an ideology, of liberal do-goodism as exemplified by Hubert Humphrey, and it's like, not relevant to this day and age. And and I was like, hey, my values, why what I'm considering right here is right and wrong, and my values are not things that only can be traced to American liberalism, but my values go thousands of years back. And the thing that was weighing in my heart was straight out of the New Testament, the sheep and the goats, that which you do to the least of mine, you also do to me. And thinking about that, compassion doesn't have a whole lot of qualifiers, right? If you have an imperative of compassion as a society, it's not like you only care about people if they're not ornery or not smelly or not dual diagnosed. And that definitely affected my decision to allow the homeless shelter to continue. And PATH is still here because of that narrow vote.
Yeah. It's gone through some evolution for sure. And it does not, well, we won't go there, but it was definitely when they had the daily meals, and Lady Leslie Ridley Tree was providing that. And, that brought up a whole other issues, but yeah, that was a significant thing. That was a packed room and people upset about what it was going to do to the business community there and all of that. And so that was a narrow vote.
But if you remember it, Josh, what was the CUP was for was not for the winter shelter. It was for the programmatic beds where they get wraparound services and they're tried to be brought back in and get sober and get mental health care, all those things. And so it's a typical example of the problems with one thing. People get angry and then want to destroy something that is not even the thing they're angry about, right? Yeah. And the thing that's persevered at PATH is those programmatic beds that were that people were trying to get the city to deny back in that year.
Yeah. This should come as to no surprise to the people who've known you the last few years, but back then you clashed with a lot of people. You clashed with members of the city council and some of the elders who felt as though, for me, when I hear you talk and like wax poetically, when you quote the New Testament or you quote like literature or movies, like, maybe I'm an idiot, right? Maybe I like fall for that. I'm like, wow, that's really smart. Other people, when they hear that, right, they just like, what is he doing? Stop doing that. It's so fun. Like that's the reaction. And around this time, you're getting some of that, right? You're giving these really profound speeches about what it's like to serve and the purpose of serving and kindness and helping human beings. And you're getting that pushback from certain members of the council back then, even Democrats, right? How did you deal with that and handle that at that time? Because you're still kind of young and you're, like we said, you're a confident guy, right? You believe you want to be leading and you believe you should be leading. How did you deal with that kind of, at times, brutal criticism from the people you're serving with and others in the community? How did you react to it?
I think that when I look at it, clinically, or try to look at my former self clinically, I can totally get why people were irritated, with me. I totally get that. But I had something genuine and true to offer, and a lot of people, and it helped a lot of people. And so I guess back then it was full steam ahead. Like I was not worried about that criticism. I knew that it would work for some people and it would not work for others. But in retrospect, I have to say I'm really thankful, especially for the friendship of Roger Horton and Marty Bloom, who, despite the fact I was way younger, did not get overly irritated by me, by however my delivery was, but worked with me and I learned a lot from, and we did a lot of good together, because you can't do a good just yourself on a 7-person council, right? You need 4. Yeah. So I'm especially thankful of the people that I served with, because I wasn't, I wasn't trying to be, irritating. I was trying to do some good. And back then, I think my tactic was to push my friends to do more good. And I'm especially thankful that they accepted my pushing.
Yeah, you during this time, you're very effective, right? But you did run for supervisor. I think were you in your first term when you ran for supervisor? I think you were, right?
I think I was.
Okay.
That was definitely a mistake.
So let's just talk about a little bit about that. Is when you do that, people start calling you a young man in a hurry, right? Oh, he doesn't want this. He doesn't want this.
Oh, they called me that from the beginning.
From the beginning.
But yeah. I mean, look, when you feel like you're, can do some good, you just sometimes you just keep on rolling. But as dark of a place as as losing that first supervisor's race put me in. It was a very valuable lesson. It was a valuable one because I met a lot of people in the neighborhoods, and like a lot of the most important things I've always learned was talking to people who don't come to City Hall, talking to people. And I remember more than one people in that campaign saying, "Hey, Doss, I voted for you before. I'm going to vote for you again, but not this time.
Yeah.
Too soon."
Right.
And I was like, that's interesting. That's cool. That's it. I don't know if it would have happened the same way anywhere else but Santa Barbara, where people are politically enough aware that they, like somebody, know they have a contribution, but are like, maybe not here, maybe not right now. That's a level of nuance that you don't find in politics and a lot of other communities. But I think because of the level of how aware and engaged and educated the voter is here, it happens.
What do you miss about that period? If you could go back to like, what was the highlight of that time of being on council? And of course, you did get reelected again after the supervisors to another term. Um, you've had lots of stages of your political career, but what about that do you miss the most?
Well, I miss I miss there being a dedicated funding source for affordable housing. I really do. I think that's really one of the most important things that needs to be rectified in local politics. And I miss a lot of the camaraderie that can happen when you're, young in politics with other, grassroots activists. I mean, I'm an old family man now these days, so you can't spend as much time, hanging out for late night dinners after the phone bank at Roy's. It's different, and there are times that I miss that.
Yeah.
But the world has moved on.
So, you talk about when you ran for supervisor against Janet Wolf, of course, and I didn't cover that campaign, but I kind of covered you in the campaign, if you recall, but I didn't cover the whole campaign. And I think Dr. Secord ran for that, and of course,
Joe Gazzardi.
Joe Gazzardi, and
It was a four-way race, and it was like, yeah, it was chaos incarnate from a campaign standpoint.
Would you say that was like the campaign where you made your like some lifelong enemies? And when we get to parts 2 and 3, we'll talk about this. But I feel like that challenge of Janet Wolf opened the door for the first time to people saying, you know what? It's not that he's a young man in a hurry. It's that he's only about himself, right? And that's something that stuck. But when you think about that period, right, would you say that has lasted the test of the time? The enemies you made there, they sort of never forgave you for that challenge?
Unfortunately, that's true, and I worked really hard to to avoid that. I even election night itself, that time, I took the people from my election night party, and I went over to Janet's election night party, and I wanted to make it really clear that we should support her, and I campaigned for her, and even 4 years later, I campaigned for her again. Not 4 years later. I guess that must have been 8 years later. When Darcel, who was on my staff, took a leave of absence to go on Janet's staff, or to run Janet's campaign. I think Janet and I have gotten closer over the years, but yeah, there's a lot of that lingers. And I wish people would take the totality of service sometimes and realize, grudges don't have to last forever. Some of the, best work that I've done in politics is with people that don't agree with me on everything. And I think that it's important to not hold grudges. In a business where most people are really trying to do the right thing, they may have a different idea of how to get there than you do. But I think part of what's wrong with politics at a national level right now is this idea that we need to crush each other. And I don't think we need to crush each other. We can all be Santa Barbarans, we can all be Californians, we can all be Americans, and try to do some good in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well put. As a journalist, I'm in a weird position with you, and we've talked about this, but like I spent decades, 10 years, 15 years, like defending you, and people change and things happen, and we'll get to that in future parts. But what would you say to somebody who says DOS is about DOS? I mean, just as we wrap part one up, right? What would you say about that? That DOS is about DOS. He went from here to here. We're going to get to all the other places you served. How do you answer that or explain that?
If that was true, there would be much different paths taken. And among them was, when I was in my first 2 years in the assembly, I got a call from Karen Bass at the time saying, "Hey, we want you to run for the congressional seat." That opened up in Ventura County, which was part of my district at the time. And I remember thinking back to the Supervisors campaign that you and I just talked about, and went, I want to show my people that I'm here to see things through, that I'm there for them. And so if it's God's will that I, do that someday, then maybe there'll be another chance someday, but I'm not gonna take one when I just got here, when I just started serving them in the legislature. And, I wish people would take a totality of service, right? You don't make 100% right calls, especially when you're in the legislature and voting on 2,000 or 3,000 bills in a year. You try to make the right call every time, but you can't always do that. You just got to try to make things as good as you can make them, and you work hard, and I have. In fact, a lot of the reasons why I'm looking forward to not being in public office is that there's things that I never experienced that normal people experience, like this weird thing called weekends that you have off with your families. I'm 50 years old and I've never really experienced that in my whole life. So there's some things I'm looking forward to, that'll be important for my 6 and 9-year-olds. And so, I think people who want to think negatively about that don't know how much that people like me, not just me, but people like me, sacrifice to try to make the world better. It's a lot. It's a big burden, and sometimes it's too heavy of a burden. But it's, you take it because you believe that the world needs to be better. And if you want to take it back to all the way back, it's the first thing I can remember feeling as a human being, that something is wrong in the world. I must have been 5 or 4, maybe younger, that the world is not as it should be. And so all we can do is try to make it a little more the way it should be.
Perfect. I think that's a great way to end part one. with Doss Williams. And I don't know, Doss, maybe it's my ego, right? I think I bring out the best in you. So
I think you do a lot. I mean, I think, Josh, you understand me a lot more than some people do. But I appreciate it. It's you, and you just also have more of an intellectual curiosity than a lot of people. That's really like your superpower, perhaps, Josh, is an atypical level of empathic intellectual curiosity. And so you examine these things maybe a little bit more than other people do. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I definitely see, I don't just see what's right here, which is a great thing. And it really annoys a lot of people too. So, but people are complex. And so I think that you have had an amazing career and one of the longest serving of anyone elected, uninterrupted. And I don't think people really know the full you. And maybe some people might say, I don't know the full you, but what I do know, which is indisputable, is that I don't think anyone works harder than you. No one has worked harder than you to put yourself in a position to be successful and to make those sacrifices. And people can say a lot of things, but you've put in the work, and that's how you've lasted so long. And we'll talk about the middle stuff and then bring everybody up to speed on, county supervisors and what happened earlier this year in the next part. Okay. So thanks a lot, Doc Williams. I appreciate your time. And
thanks, man. Appreciate it, John.
Hopefully you can enjoy your weekend, right?
I will. We still got an event or two, but they're getting a little clearer now. So yeah. All right, man.
Okay. Have a great day.